Dr. Persico is a John and Helen Kellogg Professor of Managerial Economics and Decision Sciences at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, one of the world's most prestigious business schools, and Director of the Center for Mathematical Studies in Economics and Management. He received his PhD at Northwestern and subsequently taught at UCLA, the University of Pennsylvania, and NYU, before life came full circle and brought him back to his alma mater, this time as a highly regarded economics professor. Dr. Persico's research focuses on a variety of topics in economics, including the political economy, labor economics and the effects of the minimum wage, and the intersection of law and economics and judicial productivity. In 2011, Dr. Persico co-authored a paper titled A Search Theoretic Model of the Retail Market for Illicit Drugs, which explains inter alia what we can learn about moral hazard through illegal drug trades. The paper also discusses novel solutions to combat the drug trade. I am really excited to have Dr. Persico on the Sensei Kujaku show to discuss moral hazard, which has a meaningful real-world impact on our daily lives and societies as a whole. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our videos. And as always, nothing in this video is either a recommendation to or not to buy, sell, or hold any security. Hi, Dr. Persico. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Welcome to the Sensei Kujaku show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Persico, like I said in the introduction, what I sort of came across you initially as the co-author of a very interesting paper that spoke about the illicit drug trade, and that paper, of course, covers a lot on that subject. But what sort of struck me a lot from that paper was the sort of folding in of moral hazard into the drug trade. And of course, when people say moral hazard, they often think of it as an ethical question rather than an economic question. But I think it's so interesting to talk about and discuss things like moral hazard. People often think of them as these esoteric, technical terms and concepts. But what people don't realize is how much things like moral hazard affect their daily lives in the real world. So it would be great, Professor, if we could start with just you explaining the concept of moral hazard, and maybe if there's some examples you think would do a good job of explaining them in our real life.
Sure. Moral hazard is a term of art in the economics profession, and it has to do with bilateral situations where one party wants to trade with another. I'll give you an example. The example is about an unscrupulous taxi driver. So imagine you get to a town you don't know, you hop into a cab, and you tell the driver the address that you want to go. Now, there's a risk that the driver may drive you around in circles, potentially, before getting you to your destination in order to make you pay more money. So this would be a prototypical example of what economists call a moral hazard situation. Let me be now abstract a little bit. What are the general features here? The general feature is there's two parties, and they want to trade, they want to create value together, and each has a contribution. So for example, in the taxi cab example, you as the passenger, you contribute money, and the taxi driver contributes his or her time and maybe the car. And with that, there's gains from trade. More happiness is created in society than there was before. But in the case of the taxi driver, part of his or her contribution is unobservable to you. And that is whether they're driving you in the most direct way or whether they're taking a circuitous way. That element of uncertainty, of unknown that you don't know, creates what we call moral hazard. And the moral hazard is that the taxi driver can take advantage of you and charge you more than he or she should have. So moral hazard in the abstract is a trade between or value creation, joint contribution between two parties where one of the two parties' contribution is partly or wholly unobservable. This happens all the time in the economy. For example, generalizing again from the taxi driver, we can think of a general employment relationship, and the employer is going to pay some money to the employee, and the employee can then work hard or shirk. And if the employer cannot observe the intensity of effort, then again, we have a moral hazard situation. This is this is not a, how should I say, theoretical possibility. It is something that is pervasive in the economy. It is something that has, we can say, even destroyed the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union came apart, it's partly because the economic system wasn't functioning. And the reason why is that pay was not properly conditioned on effort and contribution. So there was an old joke there that they say, we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. And so that's the same idea, but expressed in a funnier way. More examples. Ethically sourced coffee. So think of Starbucks. I, as a customer, go to Starbucks, I pay my expensive coffee with caramel and what have you, and I would like my coffee to be guilt-free, meaning I would like the coffee to be ethically sourced in a way that doesn't destroy the primeval Amazonian forest. But I, as a customer, cannot check whether, in fact, Starbucks coffee is ethically sourced. So again, we have a situation of moral hazard. Starbucks can make me pay more money for a coffee that is, in fact, unethically sourced. A third and final example, going to the financial markets now and financial sector, is about the well-known now, too big to fail idea. So we had a situation in 2008 where big banks in the United States were accused of taking advantage of the system and of customers in the following way: that banks are of necessity insured by the federal government in the United States. It's called FDIC insurance, and it ensures that if the bank goes under, the government will come in and pay back money to the depositors. This is great, except if the bank starts playing fast and loose with that. That is, the fact that the government is going to back up a bank, even if it fails, means that the bank now has an incentive potentially to take a lot of risk. And that incentive manifested itself during the financial crisis with the so-called proprietary trading, where banks were not only taking deposits and investing those deposits on the behalf of customers, but they were also trading on their own behalf. And now a profit motive for the bank is introduced. And that means that the bank, because it is insured by the government, has an incentive to take on a lot of risk because it keeps the profits, but it socializes the loss. And so the bank, one last time, the bank has a moral hazard. We're in a moral hazard situation there.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear some of these examples. The global financial crisis, for instance, I think in recent times has really thrown light on the moral hazard problem in the financial sector. But even the earlier examples you gave, for example, the taxi cab example, it's something that I think anyone who's ever traveled to another country can relate to that. It's such a, common sort of experience we've all had. But before I get into some of this more, I actually want to take a step back and talk about your own journey a bit. You, of course, came from Italy, but your career has predominantly been in America itself. Could you just take a minute to talk about your doctoral research? What topic did you cover? What was the sort of research you did? Where did you do it?
Of course. As you said, I came from Italy, originally from a mid-sized town in Italy. And then I've been making my way over time to bigger and bigger towns, cities, metropolises of the world. And now I live in Chicago. My doctoral research concerned a fairly esoteric subject matter, which is the information acquisition in auctions. It is a matter that is highly technical, really mathematical, and not much worth discussing here, except for one fact, and this is that I started out as being very interested in how should I say, mathematical properties and mind teasers and things of that nature. I enjoyed that part, and now after aging somewhat, I became more interested in the practical applications of economic theory to real life. So that's really the one thing that I probably your listeners and viewers should know is this idea of going from small town to a big town, and from mathematical, theoretical interests to more applied interests.
You spoke about your doctoral research and you spoke about auctions, and I do want to discuss auctions as part of information asymmetry and some, more, we'll get into that later. But so you, of course, are currently a professor at the Kellogg School of Business. Could you talk about what classes you teach, and what, in a broad sense, what is it you cover in those classes?
Absolutely. I teach two classes. One is really a strategy class. It's called Strategy Beyond Markets. And I have a book coming out with Cambridge University Press now, a textbook for it called Strategy Beyond Markets as well. And in that class, I cover the interface between business and regulation and business and politics. So viewing politics and regulation as constraints, as problems that managers have to face, deal with at all stages of a company's life, early stage, mid stage, and then for large corporations too. So that's one class. The other class that I teach is called Crisis Management, and it's about what you would think from the title. It's stuff happens in your life as a manager of a company. Dangers can come from all over the place. And when the problem is urgent and important, what do you do first? How do you communicate? And how do you respond to activism, for example, when you're attacked by an activist? And all of this goes under the heading of crisis management.
Right. I think both are so relevant in today's world. I think crisis management is, I would say, most CEOs consider it as one of the core sort of, aspects of their jobs, and business leaders more generally. So I think it's, at any point in time, it's an incredibly useful sort of area to cover. So great. It was really lovely listening to that. I want to now get back to the main topic of conversation, which is sort of moral hazard and things associated with that. You were giving examples of instances of moral hazard that we all face in our daily lives. I want to start with the last example you gave, which was in banking, and sort of talk about moral hazard in that space, and the financial services space a little more generally. Could you talk about ways in which the issue of moral hazard, or the scope for moral hazard, can actually be mitigated? Whether that is regulatory or otherwise, what are different things that can be done to solve this problem essentially?
Of course. Well, let's start from the too big to fail that I referred to before. After the 2008 crisis, there was a big push from the part of the government at the time, the Obama administration, to in fact regulate proprietary trading, the thing that I said was giving rise to this moral hazard. And this came under the heading of something called the Volcker Rule, named after Paul Volcker, a celebrity central banker in the United States. And he pushed for this rule that said now banks cannot do proprietary trading anymore. So that would be one way that you can ameliorate moral hazard. In this case, you simply regulate it away. The government is going to come and say you can't do it anymore. Of course, this is difficult because there's good reasons for why banks may want to do proprietary trading. There's valid reasons that are pro-social. So this regulation aspect is always difficult. There's always a gray area. There's always pros and cons. Still in the financial sector, another example I might give is that of financial advisors. In the United States, financial advisors are regulated to different degrees, depending on the exact typology of the figure of financial advisor. But the general thrust of these regulations is designed to, it's about ensuring that the financial advisor operates in the interest of you, the customer who hires the financial advisor. Rather than, for example, the financial advisor making you trade a lot in order to generate fees from trading, so-called churning. And again, here there's a case where the government comes in and says, we're going to license you, but you have to, in order to keep your license, you have to be, you have to follow certain professional ethical practices. And this brings me to the second way in which we can control moral hazard, and this is by professional licensing. And another example besides the financial advisors is taxi cabs. Taxi cabs, they have their own restrictions that not everybody can drive a taxi cab. Before Uber, there was a limited, in most cities, in most countries in the world, there was a limited number of licenses that taxi cabs could in fact have. And so this limited the amount of taxi cabs that could circulate. And as a result, it allowed the taxi cabs to charge higher fees. And the logic there is to say, look, we understand that taxi cabs can cheat the customers, but if we allow these taxi cabs to earn a high fee, maybe make a good profit on their professional in their profession, then they will be more afraid of being disbarred, of not being allowed to be a taxi cab anymore. And that in itself is going to drive these taxi cabs to behave better with the customers, because if they're caught, then they can be forbidden from operating. And so that's a big loss. And so this idea of professional licensing, which is restricting the set of people who can operate in a profession or a trade, allows them to earn more money. And then you give the power to keep to control who is part of that trade or that guild or that profession to a professional body that is supposed to make sure that the bad apples are kicked out. So that's self-regulation. And finally, there is a third way that moral hazard is controlled, and this is voluntary certification. And for that, the example, I want to go back to Starbucks. You remember the concern, you go into Starbucks, but you're concerned that now the Starbucks coffee is sourced from unethically run farms, and now your coffee tastes of guilt. We don't want that. So what Starbucks does is they say, we're going to use a third-party certifier, and they do that. That is going to develop standards that they're going to check in the countries that actually produce the coffee, and that may be Colombia, maybe in South America, wherever. These third-party certifiers, they examine the operation of these farms, and for the ones that source ethically, they give a check mark, and that check mark is then printed on the Starbucks coffee boxes and coffee packages. And this way, the consumers is reassured that they are, in fact, drinking coffee that doesn't taste like guilt.
It's really interesting to actually hear about these things. And the reason I bring that up is, in your paper, which I referred to earlier, you've sort of listed some very novel and unusual and maybe sort of not necessarily intuitive ways of tackling the drug issue. And it again comes down to the same problem of how do you avoid these things. I'm going to come to that in a second. But before that, I want to just start talking about that paper itself and really the illicit drug trade and what we can learn about that. It may seem funny to describe it as such, but reputation actually plays a very important role in that trade. I mean, if you think about it from just the very sort of street level transaction that may take place where a buyer buys a small amount of drugs from a seller, it's important that both parties feel comfortable that, that neither party is going to get them in trouble. So the buyer wants to make sure that he's getting a clean product, and the seller is concerned that it shouldn't be an undercover cop or something like that. So they care about who the other person is in the transaction. What I want to understand from you is how you think about the role that reputation plays in drug purchases specifically, and what we can learn about the importance of reputation in business more generally from that.
Great question. The drugs trade is a trade where none of the ways of controlling moral hazard that I listed before, and these are government regulation, voluntary certification, or self-regulation, none of this can work because the trade is illegal. And so the government is not going to regulate, you're not going to have a credible certifier, et cetera, et cetera. So how can this trade even exist how is it possible that in an environment where the buyer has to be concerned that the drugs that they're buying has been diluted, maybe extremely diluted, how can they be confident, or at least somewhat confident, that they're buying some amount of actual potent drug? And the answer is reputation. The reputation means that you have a bilateral long-term relationship between buyer and seller, and that relationship is going to ensure that the seller is going to do the right thing by the buyer. In this case, the right thing by the buyer is the wrong thing for society, which is selling a lot of potent drug. But from the perspective of these two, the long-term relationship is an incentive, because if the buyer doesn't receive high-quality drugs, they're going to look for another seller in the future, and that disciplines the seller. So the long-term relationship is essential in that kind of a trade. And we know that reputation is really important. We know that the entire market is thirsty for something like a reputation, even a brand. And we know that because it's known that in this drug trade, the drug is often sold in these glassine envelopes. These are these transparent small envelopes. Well, these envelopes are often stamped with kind of what we might call brands, something like Zoom or Spider-Man or Superman or names like that. And these names are just stamps. They're stamped in blue ink. But the way that they work is that in a certain week, there might be a particularly good or potent or pure type of a drug that's coming into a city, and the dealers who receive it, then they put it in glassine envelopes, and they put a new stamp. Let's call it BMW. I don't know. They have these kinds of names. And so now the first user that happens to purchase a BMW glassine envelope, they try it, they like it, they think they know it's pure and good, and the word will spread. And so people are going to start looking for this BMW, except there's a problem. And the problem is, because the market is illegal, no one is stopping other dealers from also replicating the BMW brand. And so they do. And in the process, the BMW brand is tarnished. So these brands in the drug market, they last for about a week before they get tarnished by other copycats. But this example will give you an idea of how important reputation and brand is in this market, how essential it is to its functioning.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the show Breaking Bad, which of course deals with drugs, the most potent ones have a peculiar blue tinge to it, and a lot of the competitors start dyeing theirs blue to fool buyers into thinking that it is the best drug. So it's actually interesting to see in the real world that, you know, how these things actually work. But that brings me to an interesting point on extracting information from the other party in a transaction. So imagine that I am a especially unethical drug seller, in the sense that not only am I selling drugs, but I am also selling contaminated drugs, or maybe I'm just selling powdered sugar and, you know, fooling my buyer into thinking it is actual drugs. And imagine you are the buyer in that situation. What can you as a buyer do to extract the necessary information from a seller who has no desire to give you the information that would prevent the deal from being consummated? Now, of course, in my example of a street level transaction, it's not like there's going to be much dialogue, so there isn't necessarily scope to extract information then. But if you think of more legitimate real world examples, for example, if I'm buying a house, the seller may not want to tell me that, you know, the neighbor is really noisy or something like that. So what do you think are good ways to extract that kind of information from the seller?
Absolutely. In the case of the drugs, it's really the repeated relationships. It's the trust that is gained or lost over time. In the case of the house, it's a little different, because the buyer has access to certifiers. These are reputable businesses or people who can come in, check the house out, and say, oh, I see a leak here. Oh, I see some carbon monoxide there. And so there you have the access to these certifiers that are going to reduce the moral hazard problem. It never goes fully away because your basement can flood once every 5 months or once every year. And in that case, the certifier is not going to be able to catch it probably at the moment you're transacting the house. But in general, you have experienced certifiers or home assessors who can do a good job with that.
Yeah. So, Professor, I actually want to get back to the point I mentioned earlier, which is in your paper, you list some very interesting potential solutions to stopping or at least reducing the drug trade. And I suppose if you extrapolate it more generally, that anything that would be considered undesirable to society as a whole, how to prevent those sorts of activities from taking place. So, could you explain some of those to us?
Of course, and you're exactly right to focus on undesirable activities because my idea was very simple. It was to observe that we as a society want to stop the drug trade, not encourage it. And most of the solutions that are out there for moral hazard are about reducing moral hazard and encouraging trade. But in the drug trade, we want to do the opposite. So here's a simple idea. Why don't you encourage the sellers to be disreputable? And how might you do that? You might do that in a very reasonable way. And that is when a seller is caught, they might be able to get a lower sentence or maybe even no sentence if they are selling highly diluted drugs or even drugs that's not drugs at all. It's just filler. This kind of a penalty structure, which to my knowledge is not used right now, right? So right now, if a seller purports to sell 1 gram of heroin, that the penalty is proportional to the purported drug content, not to the actual drug content. And so what I'm proposing is to say, no, we're going to examine the drugs that was sold, which in fact is done routinely anyway. And we're going to calibrate the penalty to the amount of pure heroin that was found in that gram. And if we did that, that would be a big incentive for sellers to sell impure drugs, apologies, or even no drugs at all. And so the buyers, knowing this, the market would collapse because the buyer would have no trust, no faith that the seller is selling them pure or pure enough heroin. So my proposal is a common sense proposal, is to say, let's change the penalties in the court of law in a way that makes sense in the first place, but also will have this additional effect, positive effect, of increasing the moral hazard in the drugs trade.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because your solution actually focuses on using market forces and, in a sense, manipulating human behavior to arrive at a desirable outcome, versus just saying the government passes a law or explicitly says, okay, you can't do this, you can't do that. Because obviously just saying something is illegal isn't really going to stop it, right? You have to actually incent each individual potential buyer or seller to reduce engaging in that activity to have a larger aggregate outcome. So it's
absolutely. A colleague of mine who commented on this paper he said this paper is a kind of pro, because something that I forgot to mention is that if you followed my advice, it would also reduce the amount of people that are in jail for drug, which is a big problem. Because my proposal goes in the sense of reducing penalties, not increasing them. So a colleague of mine commented that this is the kind of leniency that even a very conservative person can get behind.
Yeah, I think it's actually important that for these really critical questions for societies, it's to have something that has dual or maybe even more benefits, right? It's not just, it's sort of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, and how you can actually apply that to maybe different things. For example, you may have something like smoking, which is not illegal, but it has detrimental consequences to society as a whole. So maybe there's ways to incent that I mean, not exactly. I'm not suggesting we contaminate cigarettes, but it's a way to sort of, something to think about really, for what we would generally consider sin goods or
Absolutely.
sin stocks. Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
could, along the same lines, you could probably tax the amount of actual nicotine that's contained in the cigarettes as opposed to just the cigarettes themselves. Because as we know, cigarettes vary in their nicotine content, and in particular these e-cigarettes now, you can make the nicotine content as high as or as low as you want.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. If your tax was simply a function of the nicotine, concentration or nicotine component in a cigarette, I think that would obviously very logically incentivize, having a low. So okay, very very interesting. Actually, that's something to think about. Um, but Professor, I want to start talking a little more about information asymmetry and in the context of moral hazard, and sort of something. And I think this is interesting, and it brings me back to the broad topic of your doctoral research, which is auctions. And I mean, in the sense that I want to talk about the potential for information asymmetry to, in certain sectors or industries, actually end up creating some form of, if not monopolistic, but oligopolistic or duopolistic, sort of industry in that sense. And I'll explain what I mean. If I think about the art market, the sort of high-end luxury art market, where a lot of the transactions happen through auction houses, so Sotheby's, Christie's, or someone like that. And I think of the sort of information flow that happens there. The reason companies like that are so valuable and people value their services is, if you think about it first from the seller's perspective, what he wants is simply the highest value from selling that art piece. And he obviously, I mean, you could be sitting in New York, but the person with the greatest propensity could be sitting in London, and without Sotheby's, you would never find this guy. And because Sotheby's has that Rolodex of all potential buyers, so from the seller's perspective, that information as such is sort of housed within very few organizations. And more importantly, I think from the buyer's perspective, in a market where there is so much quote unquote contamination. In this case, the contamination is forgeries, fakes. And I mean, the fakes are incredible, right? It requires a very, very well trained eye to even spot the minor differences that would, that would indicate that it is a fake or a forgery. And so what happens is, as a buyer, the minute, you get that, essentially stamp from Sotheby's or Christie's saying, okay, this is a legitimate Picasso, you can go ahead and bid for it. It gives you that confidence to buy it. So in that sense, what happens is, because of that sort of cycle that forms of trust from both the buyer and seller, companies like Sotheby's or Christie's, it gets very difficult to compete with them, and they just increasingly get a larger share of the overall market, and they form, like I said, a duopolistic, oligopolistic industry. So I want to get your sense of whether you agree with that, everything that I said, or you think that that may happen in a particular industry, but as a whole, information asymmetry cannot be linked to formation of that market system.
Yeah, I think it could. I think the example you gave about Sotheby's and Christie's is a good one, and the idea that you're proposing here is the idea that trust is capital, is a capital and the more capital you have, the more you can be trusted, the more trust capital you have. But in order to get the trust capital, you have to transact a lot. And so this means that only few firms can exist in the market, and maybe they have a lot to lose, right? So I agree with that. And this goes back to the taxicab example, where we said the government restricts the number of taxicabs by fiat. The government can do that. What you're saying here is maybe the market will do that for the government, in that if we have few firms in a market, maybe just one, they will be very wary of losing their reputation by allowing forged works of art to be traded, and so having few players in the market, maybe not one but two, is helpful in that respect. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I want to touch upon something you mentioned, which is the link between moral hazard and repetitiveness in transactions. So if you think about it, let's say your local grocer who you go to maybe once a week or even more frequently, he has an incentive to create that relationship with you, and therefore, in a very elementary sense, is less likely to cheat you in some way, right? He wants to create that longer term relationship. Whereas you think of the other extreme where it could be, conspicuous purchases which you made once, twice, maybe in your life. You think about, let's say, buying a diamond ring because you want to propose to your girlfriend. It's that one-time purchase where there is tremendous potential for information asymmetry, right? If I walk into a store, I'm not going to know a good diamond from a bad diamond. So
Sure.
if the jeweler sees, I mean, I'm the ideal guy to fool, right? I know nothing about it. If he tells me it's worth 100, I'll believe him. I have no other option. So I want to just get your sense of the link between repetition of transactions and the scope for moral hazard. And if you think that, like I said in my example, if the fact that because something, a transaction is going to be repeated constantly, whether that actually does incent better behavior or it isn't actually the case in reality.
Of course it does. And the example you gave is great. We all have in mind examples where we're doing a large purchase that all of us will do once, twice, maybe a few times in our lifetime. A good example is children's braces. They can be expensive, and you hope not to purchase it many times for the same child. So that's a case where you actually are going to look around for a dentist, an orthodontist, who has a long reputation, right? And that reputation is established not with you over time because you only buy it once, but with other people, maybe in the community, etc. And so you're absolutely on point. Again, this goes back to this idea of reputational capital or trust capital.
Yeah, it's interesting that you speak actually that's a very interesting point. You don't think about, like I said, my initial point, which is moral hazard affects all of us in our daily lives, and we don't think about it. So it's actually really, I think the braces example is really great, right? You think of something that by definition once you're going to have in your life, and you want to make sure it's the right thing. And what happens is the minute the seller or the provider of services in this case has a good reputation, it allows him to charge more. He can charge above market rates and still actually not affect incoming demand from. And if anything, the fact that he charges more, do you think it is in some sense a signal that he is a quote unquote good actor? Do you think that that ever happens?
That's absolutely true. Yes, it is a signal. And moreover, it is a real incentive because if this guy can charge a lot of money, he better make sure that there's no unsatisfied customer out there because otherwise this big flow of money is going to decrease. So it all works. It all works well together.
Yeah. And I just want to again get your sense of how um, the the quantum of sale affects moral hazard. So if, for example, it's a low ticket item, are people more likely to engage in, let's call it, bad behavior versus if it's a very, so for example, it could be a house or a car or something like that, which is a higher ticket purchase. Do you think that there is a link between the value and the likelihood of cheating as such?
Look, I think the incentive to cheat is more or less proportional to the size of the good that's being transacted. I think we've all had experiences with buying rotten fruit. At least I have. That's a small ticket item that, nevertheless, I would say is highly subject to this kind of moral hazard. But you also have that risk in houses, where so it's a big ticket item. But in houses, it makes sense to pay money to hire a certifier. There's the home inspector I mentioned before. When you buy fruit, it doesn't make sense. So you're going to have more events where moral hazard takes place.
Right. And Professor, just one last question on this topic before we end. I want to get your sense of whether you think governments or government agencies or regulators or whoever the case may be, do you think that, again, this is a very broad sense, I don't mean to target anyone in particular, that do you think that they truly understand the importance of moral hazard in advance versus after the fact? So I'll tell you what I mean. So it's easy to talk about moral hazard after the bank goes bust and say, oh, the CEO did this and he should have done that and all of that. But do you think that regulators, again, in general, just do a good enough job of preempting bad behavior And what do you think that they can do more of or less of to help prevent bad acting in society as a whole?
Well, as you said, the question is of a quite general nature. So you mentioned financial regulators, so I'm going to speak to that, and just to make it a little more narrow and concrete. Financial regulators in the United States operate under two limitations. Number one, they can't pay very much relative to what the private sector can pay. And so as a result, the best talent is attracted to the private sector rather than to the regulatory sector. The second problem is regulators do not see what goes on inside private corporations. And so they are limited in their knowledge of what is going on, and that limits their ability to regulate properly. So these are two important limitations that regulators face. Given those limitations, regulators do a fairly good job, I would say. Overall, there are important features of financial regulation in the United States that are right. And what I mean by that, for example, is the FDIC insurance I mentioned before. Before this insurance was in place, banks, consumer banks, were subject to bank runs, like the recent Silicon Valley Bank. Okay. The problem with Silicon Valley Bank was that most of the deposits were of a magnitude greater than what the government insures through the FDIC, which is $250,000 in the US. So that gives us a sense of how good this FDIC, how important and helpful it is, FDIC regulation, because as soon as you have a bank that is essentially not very protected by that regulation, you have bank runs. So that's an example of the many good things that financial regulation does. Now, is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. In part because it's subject to these two fundamental limitations that I mentioned before. The ability to attract talent and the inability to observe what's really going on in corporations. But within those limitations, I think US regulation is good.
Yeah. Well, Professor, I just want to end with one question, which is in some sense a little more personal. I think of people who've devoted their life to teaching in a sense, and research, teaching, and sort of understanding the world better, and helping others understand the world better. I want to get your sense of what excites you the most about teaching, and why what you enjoy about it the most.
Great question. What I enjoy about teaching, and I do enjoy it, is changing people's minds if I can occasionally. It's one of the hardest things to do, and one of the sweetest things to hear when you hear you were right. And so that's really what I enjoy when I teach.
Right. Well, Professor Persico, thank you so much for taking the time. It was genuinely so interesting hearing your thoughts on moral hazard. And like I said at the start, it's one of those things that it seems so esoteric and seems so technical and complicated, and you feel like you need to do a PhD just to understand what it means. But it's actually so important to all of our lives, right? We like in the various examples you gave. It actually affects each of us virtually on a daily basis. So I think it's an important thing to understand, and even especially if you're in business in some way, right? It's important to think about your reputation, and we often don't realize how much of an impact things like intangible things like reputation have on our business, our profession, and the impact it has on whether or not we're successful in whatever we do. So it was really, really wonderful talking to you, and once again, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.